mate of mine named George had been working late one night down the pit. We'd been trying to fix one of the conveyors that had been broken for some time now, but we weren't having much luck. I think with most people I would have gotten annoyed by now, but me and George have always gotten along. He was an old boy with a good sense of humour, and I had known him before I started working down the pit. We were exhausted, and we decided to make our way back up to the top. We had to go through the long, dark passage, with only our headlamps to guide us, and the occasional light we could see in the distance. Sadly, being unable to fix the belt, we weren't able to ride it back up to the top, forcing us to walk. All I could think of on the way up was a nice pint back in the pub. I think George agreed with me there, especially on the upward sections where his knees began to hurt. We must have been walking for at least a good 5 minutes, and every so often George would stop to scratch his knees. I found the noise irritating, probably just due to the fact that it was so quiet and the noise would linger in the back of my mind. It wouldn't take long, however, for me to lose my cool with him. He told me to F off, and we would stop talking for a while, but eventually he would turn around and apologise, and I would apologise back. I think the silence and the darkness was getting to the both of us, and we just really wanted to make it back up to the top by this point. We must have been going for about another 5 minutes, and by this point I started to hear the scratching again. I was about to tell George to knock it off, but he turned round and told me to stop mocking him. I told him that it wasn't me. He sort of turned round and gave me a look that he didn't believe me. I tried to tell him that I thought it was him, but he sort of just looked at me still. He turned round and we continued walking for another 2 minutes. That was when the sound started again. Again, George turned round to look at me. He looked at me more angrily, but he had a bit of confusion on his face afterwards. The sound continued, but he was looking right at me and I wasn't doing anything. We stood there both staring at each other for a good few seconds. That was until George went over to the belt and gave it a quick kick. Not long after, the scratching stopped, so we both just assumed it to be rats or mice climbing along the belt. We went along for another 2 minutes. That was until a large bang, almost like someone kicking the side of the belt. We stood there confused, and we looked back down the long, dark tunnel. We couldn't see anything, but we both were terrified. We continued on, and not long after, George would tell me that it was probably just some rats jumping onto the belt. It really calmed my nerves, and we eventually reached a lit-up section. The lights really do help to calm your nerves, and it made me think how much closer we were to the top and how much closer we were to getting that point. We decided to take a quick stop to quickly rest our legs so we could make the last final stretch out. As we got up to go, I looked behind us, and there, at the end of the tunnel, at the very edge of the lights, I could see a man, or what appeared to be a silhouette of one. I was slightly confused. Me and George were probably some of the last people coming out of the pit that night. I pointed it out to him, but he said he couldn't see anything. We continued our way back up to the top, and eventually we did reach the surface after about another 10 minutes. We were able to get to the pub in time for last orders. We sat there exhausted with our pints in hand. George looked up at me and said, "I saw it too. I just didn't want to think about it." I remember a story my grandfather told me when he had just started working at a quarry in the Rockies. At first, it seemed like any other mundane day at work, being shown the ropes by the other guys at work there and doing some basic tasks, but not long after this, it would be a day that he would never forget. It was about 1 o'clock, and the sun was beating down on him, something my grandfather would always point out when telling us this story. Not long after he had finished eating his lunch, someone shouted, "He's here." Within seconds, Everyone had stopped what they're doing and had quickly began scrambling around. My grandfather had no clue what was happening until someone grabbed his hand and quickly rushed him towards a shed, where they quickly ran inside and locked the door behind them. The man would press his back against the door, and he would slowly slide down until seated. He gestured towards my grandfather to do the same. Shocked and scared, my grandfather complied and did what the man said. When my grandfather went to ask what was happening, the man just held a finger to his lips. Didn't want them to say a thing. Not long after, they heard someone running outside, panicked, panting. He tried the door, but it was locked and he couldn't get in. Not long after, a few bangs and a few pushes on the door, he ran off to find somewhere else to go. They sat there for a while in silence. My grandfather was confused and scared, as he didn't know what all the commotion was about. Why was everyone so panicked? Why had this man quickly rushed him into this shed, locked the door, and wouldn't even open it for the other man outside? The other man sat there, eyes closed, almost as if he was trying to hold back tears, silently muttering to himself. The silence continued for about 10 minutes. That was until they heard footsteps outside. The man quickly raised his finger back towards his mouth, his eyes open, staring at my grandfather. The walking continued, almost as if it was circling the shed. Then they heard a voice. "Excuse me, can someone help me?" My grandfather was confused. Why were they scared of someone looking for help? What was wrong with this man? And why were they so dead set on hiding from him? As these thoughts went through his mind, the voice cried out again. "Excuse me, can someone help me?" My grandfather continued to sit there in silence, the other man still looking at him with his finger to his lips. That was until a bang on the door. "Excuse me, can someone help me?" the voice said again. My grandfather was confused. That sounded exactly the same as the last time, and the time before. The other man just sat there, crying, silently to himself. They continued to sit there for another 2 minutes, in complete silence, whilst the footsteps surrounded them. The voice would play out for a fourth and final time, before the footsteps began to walk away. About 15 minutes later, there was a large bang on the door, and a voice said it was safe to come out now. The other man stood up, wiped the tears from his face, unlocked the door, and left. My grandfather was still sat there, quiet, but now confused. What was safe about this man and not the one before? He walked outside and quickly ran up to the man, and he asked him, "What was that? Why did we have to be so quiet?" The other man just looked at him and said, "We don't like to talk about him."